Darwinism specifically is the idea that all living things are descended from a common ancestor by unguided processes, unguided natural processes, such as accidental mutations and survival of the fittest. That is Darwinism. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem for two reasons. One is it doesn't fit the evidence, so it's a problem for science. What sorts of evidence do you think of when you think of the so-called overwhelming evidence for evolution? Fossils, okay? Fossils are dead things that have turned to stone. They tell us some things about the history of life. But what fossils do not and cannot tell us is how they are related to each other. Imagine, for example, digging up two human skeletons, heaven forbid, two human skeletons in your backyard. There's no way you can tell how those two skeletons may or may not be related to each other. The only exception is if you get DNA out of them and the DNA is identical, then you've got identical twins. But apart from that, you can't tell how they're related to each other. And they're recent, and they're from the same species. When you look at fossils that are from millions of years ago in some cases, from different species, there's just no way you can connect them in sequences of ancestry and descent. What you do, or what Darwinian biologists do, is they assume that Darwinian evolution is true, and then they impose that on the fossil record and somehow try to get the fossils to fit the picture. Even then, there's a problem. The fossils aren't that accommodating, and actually the fossil record in many respects is a big mess. We think of molecules as evidence for evolution. Well, we can use molecules to trace lineages within existing species, but I said that's not the problem. When we try to connect different species with their molecules, we run into problems. You've maybe heard that we're closely related to chimpanzees because we're 98 or 94 or 96 or 95.5% similar to them in our DNA. The numbers themselves are very slippery. But when you think, DNA has 4 subunits, 4 letters in its code. So any living thing with DNA is going to be at least 25% similar to us. So when you hear somebody say you're 90x% similar to a chimpanzee, you can say, well, I'm also 25% daffodil. Makes just as much sense, or no sense at all. Here's the ultimate problem for Darwinism. Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species. He claimed that he could explain how new species originate. And they originated, he said, by extending what we see happening within species to the creation of new species over millions of years. And what we see happening in existing species is variation and selection. Well, despite what you may have heard or been given the impression of in your classes, no one has ever observed the origin of a new species by variation and selection. They've tried, they've looked everywhere, they've tried to do it in the laboratory, they've watched for decades, they've done it with bacteria in which you can produce tens of thousands of generations in the lifetime of a particular scientist. And they have never seen the origin of a new species by variation and selection. So the starting point of Darwin's theory has yet to be demonstrated. And from there on, it's speculation. You may have heard that, well, we can mutate things and change their genes and produce new species this way. Again, this is false. I'm an embryologist by trade, and I know that I can do anything I want to, say, a fruit fly embryo, change its genes any way I want. In fact, it's been done. And there are only 3 possible outcomes: a normal fruit fly, a defective fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly. That's it. So the evidence for Darwinism is much, much, much weaker than you may have heard.